Chapter 12. Revelation. Joe sat on his porch in a rocking chair and watched the wind whip across the field. The sun had burned off the wetness from the previous night, and Rachel hadn't come home. Joe packed his pipe full of tobacco and puffed at it nervously. The boy hadn't come home either. Joe had buried Murray's body under the porch and burned anything that had been stained with blood. "I've made a mess of this," Joe thought. "I never should have spared that boy. I should have been stronger in my faith." The day was hot, but the breeze made it nice. He wished he could enjoy it. Should he go looking for them? Should he wait? As Joe sat pondering his regrets, a horse and rider came into view. Joe raised an eyebrow and made to stand, but then thought better of it. If he seemed too eager to greet the rider, he might give away that something was amiss. So Joe continued rocking and smoking as the rider approached the farm. It wasn't odd that someone should come out to Shine Farm, so Joe couldn't be sure this visit concerned his wife or son, or the blacksmith. However, the rider did travel with haste. Joe's heart was in his throat, but he was disciplined enough not to let it show. He sat and smoked and waited. As the horse reached the gate, the rider quickly dismounted. Without even tethering his horse, the rider opened the gate and walked quickly up to the porch where Joe sat. "Rachel? Rachel?" "Rachel ain't here, Bob," Joe said, recognizing the man as he came closer. Bob Grinnell was the town baker, and when he heard Joe's response, he dropped his shoulders and uttered a sigh of relief. "Oh, Joe," Bob said. "Thank the holy you're here, Joe. It's Edgar. He's with Doc Aaron. You'd better come right away, and Rachel too. She should come too, right away. Did I hear you say Rachel's not here?" Bob spoke a million miles an hour. Obviously, something bad had happened to the boy. Now Joe couldn't hide his worry, and he jumped out of the rocking chair. "Tell me what happened, Bob," Joe said, and narrowed his eyes. "Edgar is with the doc. Like I said, he's hurt bad, but he's alive." "What happened, Bob?" Joe asked more intensely. Bob took a step back. "Well, we don't know exactly, but, well, maybe you should sit down to hear this, Joe." "I'm fine where I am," Joe shot back. "Okay, Joe, okay, just calm down. Like I said, we don't know exactly how it went down, but it seems your boy and Pritchard Barton had a fight, and I don't exactly know how to say this, Joe." Bob wiped a bit of perspiration from his brow. "Edgar killed Pritchard Barton." "What?" Joe was stunned. "Yep," Bob said. "We found the two boys in the blacksmith shop. Edgar was on top of Pritchard, and it took 3 of us to pry him off. Nobody really knows what happened." "All right, Bob," Joe nodded. "Let's go." "Well, what about Rachel?" Bob asked. "She ain't here, Bob," Joe shouted with frustration. "Now let's go!" Joe ran to the barn and got his horse. Bob returned to his horse, eyes sunken from the day's events, and fell once before successfully mounting the animal. Both men rode off as quickly as they could. He doesn't know, Joe thought. He doesn't know anything. Joe walked into Doc Aaron's office and saw who he guessed was Edgar lying on a cot. It was certainly a child, but there were bandages all around its head with the exception of a hole for the nose and a hole for the mouth. Joe didn't see any other major injuries, but the child had cuts and scrapes all along its arms and legs, as well as a few on the hands that had been stitched up. Joe wanted to walk to the bed, but he couldn't. He was frozen with fear. "I'm sorry you have to see Edgar like this, Joe," Doc Aaron said as he walked into the room. Joe started, and Doc Aaron pointed to a seat over by his desk. They both sat down, and Doc Aaron took out a pipe, not unlike the one Joe had smoked just a while ago, and lit it. Smoke filled the air as the doctor spoke. It gave Joe the feeling he was in a dream. "I'll start with the big stuff," Doc Aaron said. "Edgar's alive, and from what I can tell, barring any major infections, he should continue to live a long life. That's the good news." He took another long pull from his pipe. "The bad news, Joe, is that Edgar was burned in the face. So bad his eyes were burned as well. Edgar'll have scars, no doubt, and it's likely he'll never see again." Now Doc Aaron stopped and looked at Joe, as if they were acting out parts from a play Doc Aaron had practiced for years, effortlessly embodying his part and looking up at the other player as if to say, "Your line." "How did it happen?" Joe asked. "Well, we can only assume there was a fight between your boy and the Barton boy," Doc continued. "We found a dead dog in the shop, apparently stabbed with a dagger we saw close by. Also, there was a half-charred log outside of the hearth. I have to assume that was the cause of your boy's burns." Thinking swiftly, Joe asked, "Where was the blacksmith through all this? He must know something." "We were hoping you might be able to answer that question, Joe," Doc said, and Joe's heart jumped into his throat. "I don't know if you were aware of the situation or not, but over the past month or so, the blacksmith had been doing work for your wife. We had hoped you, or she, might know his whereabouts." Once Joe realized he wasn't being accused of anything, he thought frantically for a plausible lie. He knew his wife would never give him away because she was just as guilty of adultery as he was guilty of murder. Rachel had as much to lose as he did. That meant the boy was the only witness left. After a moment, Joe decided to roll the dice and hoped the trauma Edgar had suffered would somehow strip his memory of the blacksmith's demise. "The truth is, Doc," Joe began, "and I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but I don't even know where my wife is. You see, I came back last night to an empty house. I was preparing to come into town this morning, hoping to find Rachel and Edgar, but dead Bob Grinnell showed up. Now, well, I just don't know what I'm supposed to think." Doc Aaron shook his head. "I'm sorry, Joe. I know this must be real disturbing for you. All of it." A knock came at the door and a heavy man poked his head through the doorway. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," Doc Aaron said. "Come on in, Sheriff." "I know you're dealing with a lot right now, Joe," Sheriff Daniels said with a slightly bowed head, "but we need to talk." "Yes, Sheriff," Joe nodded in agreement. "I'll give you gentlemen some space," Doc Aaron said. He got up from his desk and left the room. "As you can imagine, Joe," Sheriff Daniels began, "Miss Barton is in an uproar. She wants full charges brought against Edgar and the blacksmith. There's nothing you need to worry about, though. We know the Barton boy was a bully to all the younger kids, and given what happened to the dog and to Edgar, it's pretty clear your boy was acting in self-defense. However, I do want to ask you some questions about the blacksmith. We have an obligation to find out what level of responsibility he has in all this." "Doc Aaron just told me about the blacksmith," Joe said. "This was the first I heard of him doing any work for Rachel. I'm afraid I don't really know the nature of his involvement with my family." "Would you happen to know his whereabouts?" the sheriff asked. "No, sir," Joe replied. "I'm sorry. I returned just last night to an empty house, and I still haven't seen Rachel." The sheriff looked surprised at this revelation and scratched his beard. "Joe, had you ever noticed, maybe sometime in the past, the blacksmith looking at Rachel in a funny way, or maybe making a pass at her?" Sheriff Daniels asked. So far, this was going exactly where Joe had hoped it might. "No," Joe said innocently. "I mean, I don't think... You don't think they might have..." No, I'm not saying anything, Joe. I just think it's best for us to have all the information we can." Sheriff Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. All of a sudden, he was finding it hard to look Joe in the eyes. "Well, I'll let you know if we find anything else out. In the meantime, take care of that boy. If it's not too much trouble, I'd like to stop by in a week or so and talk to both Edgar and Rachel. You know, after the boy's healed up and ready to speak." "Of course, Sheriff," Joe said. "I'm sure Rachel will be back at the house soon. She probably had business in a neighboring village and decided to leave the boy at home. He's getting older, and I'm sure she figured he'd be all right on his own. This will be hard on her, but we'll get through it." "I'm sure you're right, Joe," the sheriff said. "And like I said, I'll be sure to let you know of any new information we gather." "Thank you, Sheriff. Holy be, Joe." Doc Aaron wanted Edgar to stay overnight before going home, so Joe told the doctor he would stay close in case Edgar's condition changed. He stayed the night at the village inn, and then when morning came, made his way back to find Edgar awake. His head was still wrapped in bandages, so Joe walked close to the bed to let the boy know he was there. "It's me," Joe said. "It's your papa." Edgar said nothing. "He might not talk for a while," Doc Aaron said. "Sometimes when children go through traumatic experiences, they stop talking for a few days. I wouldn't let it bother you, Joe. Just keep an eye on it." Doc Aaron gave Joe a salve for Edgar's burns and made him swear to come back quickly if the boy's condition worsened. Joe thanked the doctor, and then he and Edgar headed for home. Weeks went by, and Rachel never returned to Shine Farm. Joe began to think it was for the best. How would the two of them ever be able to get past the events of that night? Joe still loved her, though, and hoped she was all right. For weeks, Rachel was all he could think about. Joe cried himself to sleep at night, yet was unable to find the motivation to search for her. He knew this was his punishment. He knew he deserved everything he got. Edgar still wasn't speaking. Sheriff Daniels had been by a few times, but he couldn't get Edgar to acknowledge his presence. At the end of the last visit, Sheriff Daniels declared the case closed and told Joe he wouldn't bother him anymore. He said Miss Barton would just have to deal with the fact that Pritchard was dead and the blacksmith was never coming back. The sheriff didn't say anything about Rachel. It was nothing any of the townspeople wanted to talk to Joe about. They all believed Rachel had run off with the blacksmith, and they felt great pity for Joe. Doc Aaron had been by for multiple checkups on Edgar as well. "I'm sorry, Joe. Blindness is all that afflicts your boy," he had said. "He just doesn't want to talk." Joe wasn't sure Doc Aaron was right about Edgar's speech, but about a year later the doctor's diagnosis was proven correct. One night Joe woke to find Edgar standing at the end of his bed, screaming. The boy scared Joe so badly he thought he would have a heart attack. "Edgar!" Joe yelled over him. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" The boy stopped yelling, but didn't say anything. Edgar just stood there, looking like a corpse in the moonlight, until Joe finally got out of bed and escorted him back to his room. Edgar's appearance was haunting. His scars had healed a dark red and eerily emphasized the milky white orbs that were his eyes. Joe had tried to make Edgar wear a cloth around his head, given the fact that his eyes were useless. Yet much to Joe's dismay, Edgar would not keep the cloth on. What was possibly more disturbing to Joe was that Edgar remained silent with the exception of random outbursts every few months. On one occasion, Joe and Edgar were in the middle of a meal when Edgar suddenly stated, "I ate that boy." "What?" Joe said, and slowly brought his hands down to the table. "I tore his flesh away with my teeth," Edgar said, "and then I swallowed it." Joe reached for his whiskey glass. Alcohol was what he used to cope now. He couldn't leave the farm very often due to Edgar's blindness, so he was unable to do his missionary work. Without money coming in, he and Edgar mostly survived on the charity of villagers who had taken pity on them. Joe was trapped, so he escaped to the bottle. Soon his actions became as random and wild as Edgar's. Joe would rant and rave and drink himself unconscious most nights. He tried to keep himself far away from the boy he called son. Sometimes he would run outside and scream obscenities in the sky until he was hoarse. It never affected Edgar, though. Every night after dinner, he took the same place in the rocking chair out on the porch and stared out into the blackness of his world. His demeanor never changed, and he never reacted to Joe's tirades. That was until one particular night when Joe decided to make the boy the target of his animosity. Edgar sat in the rocking chair and stared into the nothingness, unaware of how red the sunset was when Joe started in on him. Sweaty and slurring, Joe set a chair down on the porch next to Edgar and stared drunkenly into the boy's white eyes. "What are you staring at?" Joe mumbled, so drunk he couldn't keep his eyes straight. Edgar said nothing. "I said, what are you staring at?" Joe screamed, blasting the boy with spittle and noxious fumes. Edgar didn't even flinch. "You can see him, can't you?" Joe said sullenly now. "I bet he's talking to you right now, isn't he?" "Yeah, he is. I knew it. He won't talk to me anymore. I failed. I was not faithful. I was disobedient." Joe stood but stumbled, then picked the chair up and threw it off the porch. "Do you know why I failed, son?" he asked. "Do you know why he won't talk to me anymore, huh? It's because I didn't kill you." A manic grin came over Joe's face, and he laughed wildly. "Can you believe that? He wanted me to kill a baby. But now I know why. Now I know why." Joe sauntered over to Edgar and put his reeking face inches from the boys. "Because he knew that you would ruin everything. You brought that blacksmith here, and he ended up dead. You made your mother leave. You killed that poor Pritchard Barton, and look at me." Joe stood to his full height and took a few steps back, spinning around. "You ruined my life." Joe tripped and fell on the porch. Then he began to cry. Lying on his back, he bawled like a child. "But that's what I get for not having enough faith in him," he slurred. "That's what I get, you know? That was the last time he talked to me. That was it. After I brought you here, he never talked to me again. I had to go find odd jobs in other villages so your mother wouldn't think less of me." Joe stopped his crying and sat up. "But you don't even know what I'm talking about, do you? Do you? You don't even know what I was. Well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you everything whether you want to hear it or not." Edgar hadn't moved a muscle until this point, but now he turned and looked directly at Joe, his useless white eyes burrowing into the drunk. "It was he who used to talk to me, Edgar," Joe continued. "The Holy himself. He would tell me to do things for him. It was easy at first. Little stuff. I think he was testing me, but then he wanted me to kill. He would tell me who to kill and where to find them, and after I did it, I'd find my pockets full of gold. I was an assassin for the Holy himself, and I never asked questions, not once, until you." Then Joe wept again. "I'm not your father, and Rachel wasn't your mother. I killed your parents because the Holy told me to, and I was supposed to kill you. But I didn't. I was too weak. I didn't have enough faith in him, and now look at what's happened." Joe put his hands to his face and kept sobbing. "You won't even talk to me." Edgar stared into the blackness, toward the man before him, and then moved away from the rocking chair. He knelt down so he could be face to face with Joe. He grabbed Joe's hands and moved them away from his face. "You should have killed me, Joe," the boy said.